Shall come to order. We are meeting today to consider 10 bills. All have been properly noticed and circulated, and there are copies available on each side of the dais, along with the copies of timely filed amendments. Amendments filed after the deadline have been circulated electronically. Pursuant to committee rules, other members of the committee may submit written opening statements for the record. I ask that members may revise and extend the remarks on the bills to be considered at this markup and have those remarks included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3I and House Rule 11, Clause 2, I announce that I may postpone further proceedings on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the ayes and nays have been ordered. The item for consideration is H.R. 3541, offered by Representative Carvajal. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the bill, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment. I now recognize myself for a few remarks. It goes without saying that the House of Representatives is entering a historic and difficult period. And it also goes without saying that much of the attention will be on the process of impeachment inquiry and the aftermath of that inquiry. And much of the oxygen in terms of Capitol Hill and the work of committees will be consumed by this process. But this committee and its jurisdiction, we will continue to have hearings, we will continue to have markups, and we will continue to move legislation because that is the responsibility that we have in this jurisdiction, regardless. And this bill and other bills we will be marking up today are important pieces of legislation to help us in the fight against climate change. I'm sure many of you heard the IPCC report on ocean and climate change was released today. The news is dire and worse than we had thought. The report is pretty clear. Carbon emissions are driving changes in all parts of the world, and we are nearing a point of no return. For some harms, we've passed that point a while ago. Warmer, more acidic oceans are disrupting fisheries and fueling more intense tropical storms that bring extreme rainfall and elevated storm surge. The report found that we will have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to adapt to climate change, not millions, billions. I sincerely hope that my colleagues will take this information seriously and support the legislation that is before us today as a small step forward in building a more resilient country. Some changes are locked in, but with adaptation and mitigation, we can manage some of these changes. But we have to take bold steps and act quickly to prevent some of the most catastrophic changes like major sea level rise and the collapse of ocean ecosystems. Last week, we heard from youth climate activists who asked us what we would say to our children when they asked us if we did absolutely everything in our power to stop the climate crisis when the storms are getting worse and we are all seeing the effects. For those coming generations, let's not jeopardize their futures and by continuing a short-sighted business as usual benefit model and mitigate what we can before it's too late. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
And I recognize Mr. Lambert.
Could you clarify something? You mentioned earlier things are going to be different with impeachment in the air, but the Judiciary Committee has already been working on an inquiry, and we haven't voted on anything in the House. So I'm wondering what is different or what, I'm trying to figure out where we really stand now as opposed to just being in limbo. Can you clarify for me what is different?
Mr. Lambert, thank you for the question. And I think that answer is going to be before us soon. And I think as this process of inquiry and the formalizing of that process continues, many of the questions that you're asking me, either to justify the inquiry or to do or to talk about what would happen next, the position that I would take with you, sir, is that you're going to be part of this process. So I would be as attuned as I could as an individual member of Congress, and those answers to your questions are going to be forthcoming, and they're going to be forthcoming from the body, which is the House of Representatives.
Okay, thank you.
Does any member want to speak to the legislation? Mr. Gosar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This legislation establishes a coastal climate change adaptation preparedness and response program to assist states in developing plans to minimize negative consequences of climate change and implementation of these plans. It establishes a grant program to develop plans that identify public facilities and services, working waterfronts and coastal resources that may be impacted by climate change, and directs federal funds to reduce or mitigate coastal climate change impacts. H.R. 3541 is another example of duplication and federalism. To carry out this new program, the legislation authorizes permanent and unlimited amounts of federal funding. The CZMA program is all about allowing states to craft plans specific to their needs to adapt to a world that has been changing since the beginning of recorded time. As in the case with nearly all these bills in this markup agenda today, this bill is duplicative and completely fiscally irresponsible. I thought the other side was more about centralization and oversight instead of duplicity. It seems that what we ought to be doing is funding that appropriately if that's your motive. But this solution to climate change is to create a new program that already exists. And I would vote against it and urge everybody else to do it and simply fund the CZMA program as so desired. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gosar. Anyone else? Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. But other than that, it sounds like Mr. Gosar really likes the bill. So I have a slightly different perspective. You won't be surprised to hear. And I want to just say, Mr. Chair, I'm glad that this committee is marking up so many bills that will help with adaptation in the face of climate change, especially with the new IPCC ocean report being released today. If this report doesn't convince my colleagues to take action, I don't know what will. Climate change is going to impact every single American. For many, it already is impacting them. And the report makes clear that we are paying heavily for the cost of inaction. Water supplies are at high risk as snowpacks dwindle due to disrupted ocean and atmospheric conditions. Coastal cities could be devastated by sea level rise, and commercial fisheries could either totally collapse or move beyond the reach of our coastal communities in our children's lifetime. Now, I have been compared in this committee to Chicken Little a time or two, especially in subcommittee hearings, because I'm concerned about climate change. But the science on this is crystal clear, folks. Major investments will be required for adaptation. We need to act now to avoid future irreversible catastrophic impacts. And so I want to urge my colleague to take a look at the new IPCC Oceans Report and to support the bills today to help coastal communities and ecosystems in the face of climate change. A great example of one of those bills is the first one before us, H.R. 3541. It would help communities adapt to climate change and would amend the Coastal Zone Management Act to create a climate change adaptation preparedness and response program. This would provide technical and financial support for states with coastal zone management plans to develop statewide coastal climate change adaptation plans. The bill creates grants to support projects that implement strategies outlined in state adaptation plans, including projects to protect against natural hazards in the coastal zone, control invasive species, protect and restore wildlife habitat, and improve infrastructure. It's a very simple bill. It will help communities in the face of climate change by providing funding to help them identify vulnerable areas and develop strategies for adaptation and management. Since Congress has failed to act on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, coastal communities are now left in the lurch. At the very least, we should be passing bills like this to help them plan for adaptation in the face of climate change. Communities want to be prepared for what climate change could mean for their homes and their neighbors, and this will help them do that. So I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone? Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to yield time to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Once again, I forget that money doesn't grow on trees. And, one of the things that you look at is the CZMA program actually covers all of this. And so it seems to me that if we're looking at vital resources going to what you're pointedly wanting them to do that has the flexibility, we ought to keep down to one program and fund it appropriately. That seems like a much better dictation that I'm concerned about. Duplicity actually wastes resources. And we got to get smarter and not play harder. So from that standpoint, the CZMA is very adaptive to this program. We ought to fund it appropriately. Duplicity is not good for the wisest investment of our resources. And so with that, I once again will ask my fellow colleagues to vote against this and fund things appropriately. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back.
I yield back.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Bishop.
Yeah, I appreciate the discussion that has gone on so far because I think it's enlightening and revealing. I just want to make note that we now have a quorum here, and I appreciate the fact that my side has provided 9 of those members to finally make the quorum.
And we are all appreciative, sir.
As well you should be. The problem I have is the discussion here, and it's going to be the complaint I'm going to make as long as we keep handling this process the way we're doing. We are debating to empty chairs. I mean, look around you. This is the debate on the bill before the final vote on the bill. No one's here to listen to it. No one's here to the hearings. No one's here to the markup. It really doesn't matter what we say. In fact, I wonder why we are going through this practice of talking to nobody. I appreciate those members who are here. There are about 5 on your side that are taking this seriously. The media is here on time all the time. Thank you for that. But other than that, and staff, once again, the purpose of what we are doing is being thwarted because we are voting with our feet, and most of those feet are far away from this particular room. I remember when I first became chairman and we tried to do a process of having the speeches on the bill the night before and then just do the markup time on the amendments only, which was nice, except no one showed up for the speeches, and then you struck the last word and gave the speeches anyway the next day, so we said, screw that, we'll try something else. And we did try something else. But at least our efforts were to try and make sure that when the discussion took place, people were here to listen to the discussion. It's not happening now, and it's a procedural reason why it is not happening, and it's a source of frustration. So as much as I appreciate what you said, as much as I appreciate what Mr. Huffman said, it's still useless unless there's a hearer for that process. And procedurally, we're not doing things to emulate it. It is bad for the system, it is bad for democracy, and it may be one of the reasons why, if you talk to some of your lobbyist friends, they tend to not deal with the House anymore. They want to stop something, they go to the Senate. If they want to actually get something done, they go to the agencies who actually do a rule and regulation because it's so much faster than what we are doing. But part of that is we present ourselves as, we take ourselves out of the game. Part of it is by pushing bills that will never be heard in the Senate, but we're making a statement by it. But part of it is also the process we do in which we don't take this thing seriously enough to be there at the time when it should be happening. So I appreciate everyone who's talking about it, and a sense of frustration. I'm just sitting here saying, why? Why not just say that, let me sleep in another hour, we'll all come together at 12 o'clock, and we'll all do what the chairman tells us to do? Because that's what we're doing. Of course not.
Chairman will yield back. Yep. Anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Paulton?
Mr. Bishop, I remember, I've been on this committee over 20 years, and I can remember coming back, and the only people here were the chairman and the ranking member. Things haven't changed.
Would the gentlelady yield the balance?
Yes.
Since the ranking member declined me the courtesy of a little bit of time, although he left quite a bit on the clock, I want to speak to this canard that keeps being thrown out there that, this nostalgic view, and I would say nostalgia is not what it used to be. nostalgic view that under Republican leadership, somehow we had everyone in their seats and we were much more deliberative and there was much more of a meaningful process. You figured out a way to get people in their seats for a brief moment so votes could be cast. But every time that I and many of my colleagues tried to actually talk about policy and have a discussion, we were lectured about how we were wasting everyone's time. People were looking at their watches, they had events to go to, they had fundraisers to attend. So let's not pretend that there was some nostalgic period of great deliberation and transparent policy making. This is all about our frustrated efforts to just get through the work of the committee, and this chair is doing it in a perfectly fine job. In fact, I think we're having more robust discussions and debates in this Congress than we have in any of the previous Congresses that I've been part of. With that, I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Mr. Lambert?
Mr. Chairman, I would yield my time. Thank you for recognizing me. I'll yield my time to the ranking member of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. And Mr. Huffman, you're still wasting our time, even in this process, because you're still giving speeches to nobody, to empty chairs. It's still the same process. Mr. Napolitano, you are absolutely right. I remember those robust days. In fact, that's one of the times I remember we did a hearing, we did a markup, and there were 3 people present. So there was Ray Hall, Abercrombie, and myself. I was the only Republican in the room, and I was outvoted by 2 of you. But that's the process that needs to change. It's systemic, not just to this committee, but it's also systemic to the floor, and it has made, we have actually changed. There can be robust debate if you eliminate roll votes. Every state legislative body that requires people to be present at committees at the same time and on the floor at the same time actually has debate that follows a flow, because you don't restate everything that was done, because you were there to hear it. That is the procedural problem that is not just a problem of this committee, it's a problem of the entire Congress. That makes this meaningless, yeah. Which is why I'm not necessarily saying you're voting better if you were all here, but the process would be better. At least you would be, now, the process would be better. At least you had heard what the discussions were supposed to be. When we do amendments on these bills, no one will be here to hear them. Now I'll yield to you, Grace.
Thank you. The sad part is that some of us have committees the same time that this committee meets. It is very hard when you have votes on both committees at the same time, from one building to the other. That happened to me more than once, and you still did the job. So whatever works, we need to find a method that'll work for everybody.
Thank you. Reclaiming the time, I agree with you. You're totally accurate. And once again, there are procedures that most state legislative bodies that prohibit that. Most state legislative bodies get their committees into panels of A, B, and C, and you don't have 2 in one section. So there will never be that kind of conflict. 2010, we talked and seriously came close to trying to adopt that, but then staff decided it would be too hard to try and juggle all those who are currently on it. I readily admit what you say is a significant inherent problem in the system. It's one of the procedural difficulties that we do have. That needs to be solved at the same time. You're totally right, and I recognize that at some point. But at the same time, it doesn't stop the fact that this is yeah. When Huey Long was elected senator from Louisiana and went back the first time, they asked him if all the talking in Washington bothered him. He said, "No, the talking doesn't bother me. It's the listening that bores the hell out of me." We talk a lot. We don't listen. And if you're not here, you can't listen. Yield back.
If there is no further discussion on the legislation or amendments, is there any amendments on the legislation? There are no amendments on the legislation, then the question is on adopting the bill and ordering it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the gentleman asked for a roll call vote. This vote will be postponed pursuant to prior announcement. The item for consideration now is H.R. 3596, offered by Representative Pingree. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the bill, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment. I will now recognize Representative Huffman to speak to the legislation. Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the next bill up for debate is the Keep America's Working Waterfronts Act, H.R. 3596. It would amend the CZMA to establish a working waterfronts grant program to preserve and protect coastal areas for water-dependent commercial activities. It's a bill that establishes a working waterfront task force, a working waterfronts preservation fund, and a working waterfronts grant program so that we can identify working waterfronts within communities and fund projects that address critical needs related to economic and cultural importance. This program would also fund projects that address threats from sea level rise, extreme weather, ocean acidification, and harmful algal blooms. Coastal activities, it's important to remember, account for over 100,000 businesses and over 2 million full and part-time jobs in this country. Commercial and recreational fishing, fish processing, boat building, shipping, and tourism. These are just some of the water-dependent industries that require access to the water and would benefit from this bill. Job security in coastal communities depends on access to the water, but working waterfronts are facing growing threats from the environmental impacts of climate change, coastal hazards, aging infrastructure, zoning and land use changes, and more. So I am pleased to support Ms. Pingree's bill. It would support states and local communities' efforts to protect those jobs by preserving access to the water, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes and yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone wish to speak to the legislation? Mr. Gosar.
Yeah, H.R. 3596 attempts to preserve coastal access for water development commercial activities through a $12 million taxpayer-funded Working Waterfronts Preservation Loan Fund and a $12 million taxpayer-funded grant program. H.R. 3596 directs the Secretary of Commerce to establish and appoint members to a working waterfront task force to identify and address waterfront needs, and authorizes NOAA to administer a grant program to address issues identified by the task force. This bill also raises private property rights and condemnation issues with procurement of property under the authority of this legislation or with funds authorized through the grant program. It requires the entity administering the grant to enter into a covenant with the owner to ensure compliance. Non-compliance could result in forfeiture to the state. While it is important for states to preserve their working waterfronts, I don't believe that the American taxpayer should foot the bill. This is why states have zoning laws. That's why I oppose this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else wish to speak to the legislation? If there is no further debate on the legislation, we can begin the amendment process. Without objection, the ANS offered by myself is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. The first amendment is offered by Representatives Cunningham and Graves, designated as number 1. Representative Cunningham, you are recognized for 5 minutes to support your amendment. Sir?
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for bringing up H.R. 3596, the Keep America's Waterfronts Working Act. This amendment, which I sponsored with my friend from Louisiana, Mr. Graves, would amend the Keep America's Waterfront Working Act to include recreational boating and fishing businesses. In my district back in South Carolina, we have a thriving tourism industry, and recreational fishing and boating play a major role in that economy. You know, our working waterfronts in the Low Country face increasing pressure from a variety of sources. You know, they face increasing pressure from competing land use priorities. We see that on Shem Creek there in Charleston, and we face pressures such as sea level rise, or hurricanes, and the changing global economy. In South Carolina, tourism is what keeps our waterfronts working, which is why we need to include these recreational businesses in working waterfront planning. Recreational fishing brings almost $500 million in annual sales and extra $300 million in indirect economic benefits to South Carolina. South Carolina is also top 10 in the nation for boating, with over $637 million in boats, engines, and accessories sold just in 2017. Several companies are based there in the Low Country, including Scout, Zodiac, Sportsman's Boats, MJM Yachts, and more. This is an amendment that would do a great deal of good for the boating industry, and I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Graves, for working across the aisle with me to draft this amendment. I would urge the adoption of our amendment, and with that, I'd yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone else wish to speak to the Cunningham-Graves Amendment number 1? Hearing no further debate on the amendment, the question is on the Cunningham-Graves Amendment number 1 to the ANS. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments to the legislation? If there's no further amendments, the question is on adopting the ANS as amended. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ANS is adopted as amended.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Mr. Gosar, having asked for a recorded vote, will be postponed.
Oh,
On the final.
we'll get there. No, we're on the ANS right now.
Yeah, we're on the,
Yes.
no further,
Can you announce the, just saying the signatures.
the ayes have it, and the ANS is adopted as amended. If there's no further amendments, the question is on adopting the bill as amended and ordering favorably reported to the House. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Mr. Gosar, having requested a recorded vote, will be postponed pursuant to prior announcement. The item for consideration now is H.R. 2185, offered by Representative Norton. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration on the legislation, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize myself to speak to the legislation. The District of Columbia Flood Prevention Act is an important piece of legislation to help the district, a home to nearly every person in the room, dealing with the ongoing threat of climate change and flooding. When Congress created the Coastal Zone Management Act, they included all coastal and Great Lakes states and territories, recognizing that help from the federal government was needed to support coastal zone management, but not D.C. The majority of the district is located in a coastal plain, so this bill will rectify that omission. The district already suffers from significant coastal flooding, and scientists predict that sea level rise in the region will be higher than the global average for almost all future scenarios, further increasing the threat of flooding to the district. We hope you will support this legislation to allow the District of Columbia to enter into the CZMA, and I hope my colleagues will support the bill, and I yield back. Is there any further debate on the legislation? Any comment? Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This legislation would allow, as you have said, the District of Columbia to be included in the CZMA funding. It's landlocked. It's not a coastal community. This is a slippery slope, and when we send ourselves down this, we're justifying not only D.C., but all kinds of avenues. We're doing this because a couple of rivers are bordering D.C., but on the other hand, what about all the states that are on the Mississippi River? What about others who would be part of a watershed, and yet does that make you eligible for this coastal funding? No, it doesn't, and we don't want it to be, and so we don't want to start that slippery slope. This is what it appears to say, that you could include just about every state there is in our union. So the CZMA was created by Congress to help coastal states like Florida and other territories. The legislation completely ignores the congressional intent behind the program, and that's why I oppose this legislation. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, I want to echo what Mr. Webster has just articulated. There's a reason behind that congressional intent. As a representative from the state of Louisiana, a coastal community and coastal state that relies heavily on this funding source, it would be a slippery slope, and I believe a dangerous step for this Congress to open it up far beyond the original intent. And we would oppose it vigorously for that reason and others, but I just want to go on record as one of the coastal states to say that we cannot overstate the importance of this funding and keeping it to its original intent, and I yield back.
Gentleman yield. Begin the amendment process. Does any member wish to offer an amendment to the legislation? If there are no amendments, the question is on adopting the bill and ordering favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And a roll call has been requested. The vote will be postponed pursuant to prior announcement. The item for consideration is H.R. 3115, offered by Representative Cologne. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged from further consideration of the bill, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I will now recognize the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Huffman, to speak to the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Communities around this country are watching shorelines crumble due to sea level rise. Extreme weather records are breaking, one after another. Fish stocks are moving out of their historic ranges due to warmer waters, and the climate crisis is upon us, even if Congress fails to recognize it and act. As I've already said, the IPCC report made it clear that we must start adaptation immediately if we hope to manage the current and future impacts of climate change. And that's what this bill is all about. Congressman Pallone's bipartisan bill, the Living Shorelines Act, represents an important adaptation strategy to help coastal communities brace for the impacts of climate change. Living shorelines, including marshes, wetlands, and other vegetated areas, are critical for stabilizing shorelines, for improving ecological function, and mitigating coastal flooding. As the climate continues to change, living shorelines will provide coastal communities with an important tool for both resilience to sea level rise and natural carbon sequestration. Specifically, this bill would establish a grant program to fund the design, implementation, and monitoring of large and small-scale climate-resilient living shoreline projects intended to protect coastal communities and ecosystem function from sea level rise. NOAA supports the use of living shorelines, and their work would greatly benefit from this additional funding stream. This bill would authorize $50 million a year until 2025 to carry out this act. It provides an important tool to address the climate crisis, and I urge my colleagues to support it. With that, I yield back.
Before we consider amendments, does any other member wish to be recognized on the bill? Mr. Gosar.
Yes, once again, a broken record. H.R. 3115 directs NOAA to establish a taxpayer-funded program costing $300 million to support coastal shoreline projects already, I repeat, already eligible for CZMA dollars. When the CZMA was enacted as a comprehensive, once again, comprehensive coastal land use law, it was the view of Congress that each state had different coastal needs and priorities, and that states were in the best practical position to manage these resources. I think the folks from Louisiana would state that. H.R. 3115 inserts federal priorities into coastal zone management, countering the CZMA's original intention. Instead of spending resources on patchwork coastal management legislation, it would be in the coastal community's best interest for Congress to focus on current programs, funding them appropriately as mentioned. This legislation is duplicative. It is fiscally irresponsible. I want to reiterate, one of the things dentistry is good at is the KISS theory. Keep it simple, stupid. We can focus on priorities of money spent instead of looking at all the diversified programs that divide jurisdiction and the delay enactment at where it's needed. With that, I ask my colleagues to vote against this ill-advised bill.
The member wish to speak to the legislation? If there's no further debate on the legislation, we could begin the amendment process. The first amendment is offered by Cunningham Graves, designated as number 1. Representative Cunningham, you are recognized.
Circulate it. Yeah.
You're recognized for 5 minutes to as we circulate the bill. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment simply seeks to add accelerated land loss to the list of appropriate projects that may be carried out under the Living Shorelines Act. Coastal land loss is happening across the United States, and this is incredibly prevalent in my colleague's state of Louisiana, as well as back in the Low Country. And it's why I'm happy to offer this amendment along with Congressman Graves. Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge in my state has been losing an average of about 26 acres per year since the 1940s. And that rate may be accelerating as sea level rise increases. This massive loss of land represents a significant decline in important habitats for shorebirds, seabirds, and all kinds of wildlife. Due to the sea level rise and the loss of natural sediment deposition, Louisiana has lost over 2,000 square miles of land since the 1930s, at an average rate of 1 football field lost every 100 minutes. That's 1 football field worth of land lost every 100 minutes. But Louisiana isn't alone. This amendment will help coastal communities in South Carolina, Louisiana, and all along the coast slow the rate of land loss. I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion of the amendment? Sir?
Mr. Chairman, very briefly, I would just echo the sentiments that have been expressed and say that the reason that combating coastal erosion in Louisiana, South Carolina, and other places, Louisiana in particular, is because that coast is so vitally important to the entire nation. It is an artery for the rest of the country. The ports, the oil and gas resources that are produced and managed there fuel the whole country and fuel our free market system, the whole economy. So when we devote dollars to that preservation, it's important to everyone, not just coastal communities. And for that reason, I heartily support the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Anyone else? Discussion on the amendment, the Cunningham amendment? Hearing none. Hearing no further debate, the question is on the Cunningham Graves Amendment number 1. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Any other amendments on the legislation? If there are no further amendments, the question is on adopting the bill as amended and ordering it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Mr. Bishop, having requested a roll call, that the vote will be postponed pursuant to prior announcement. The item for consideration is H.R. 729, offered by Representative Kilmer. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife and the Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States be discharged from further consideration of the legislation, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment. I now will recognize myself to speak to the legislation. First of all, thanking Representative Kilmer for introducing the Tribal Coastal Resiliency Act, an important piece of legislation that can help tribal communities across the country build their resilience to climate change. Specifically, this bill creates a grant program under the Coastal Zone Management Act to allow 27 coastal tribes to apply for grants for the protection, restoration, and preservation of their coastal lands. In a hearing that that subcommittee chair hosted a few months ago, we heard the story of a village that had already been forced to relocate due to the impacts of coastal flooding and shoreline destabilization. This story, however, is sadly not unique. In 2009, GAO published a report citing that 86% of Alaskan Native villages were already suffering from severe flooding and erosion, and that was 10 years ago. As Congress has struggled to develop meaningful solutions to our climate crisis, indigenous communities around the country have been grappling with the impacts of climate change on a daily basis. Many tribes are already taking steps to improve their resilience, but lack access to programs and funding streams that account for the unique situation of indigenous communities. This bill would help address that issue, and I strongly encourage my colleagues to support the legislation and yield back. Is there further debate? Mr. Heiss?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the author's intent with this legislation, but I would have to oppose it. Look, under this, if projects undertaken, there's going to be 0% federal funds matching, and these type of programs are often touted for their ability to leverage non-federal funds, but it's simply not going to be the case with this. And further, this legislation does not make tribes eligible for existing CZMA grants, but it does take $5 million away from existing states' eligibility with no justification that there would be $5 million in tribal grants. And so that's concerning to me.
What do you mean by tribal grants?
As illustrated by the savings clause at the bottom of the legislation, tribes may already receive assistance for or participate in programs authorized under CZMA, but they must simply be consistent with the requirements of those of the state plan. So, you know, if we want to authorize states to or tribes to be able to participate in this program, that's one thing, but I'm very concerned with taking away funds from participating states. This whole part of it is just concerning to me, and I can't support it and would encourage others not to support it. Thank you.
Anyone else wish to speak to the legislation? Does any member wish to offer an amendment if there's no discussion on the legislation? If there are no further amendments, the question is that adopting the bill and ordering it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. The motion is considered. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Yep.
Yep. You ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Under Committee Rule 5C, I give notice of the intention to file additional dissenting views on the bill just considered, and I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all members of the committee and to apply to all bills being considered by the committee today.
Hurry up and tell me. Yeah, we told him 11. Thank you. Without objection. Anyone else wish to be? The item for consideration is H.R. 1747, offered by Representative Whitman. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged for further consideration of the bill, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment. I will now recognize Representative Whitman to speak to his legislation. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for allowing my bills, H.R. 1747, to be marked up today, and I also want to thank Congressman Veazey for being the original co-sponsor and for his support. This legislation codifies the National Fish Habitat Partnerships, an initiative that aims to achieve measurable habitat conservation results through strategic partnerships that lead to better fish habitat conditions and increased fishing opportunities. This program has been and will continue to be driven by local and regionally based fish habitat partnerships. The partnerships are comprised of representatives of federal, state, and local agencies, conservation and sportsmen's organizations, private landowners, and the business sector. This legislation provides an added layer of transparency and public involvement in project selection. Of the funding authorized in this legislation, only 5% can go to administrative purposes, meaning that more money will go to work to conserve fish habitat. Our nation's 49 million recreational anglers generate over $48 billion in retail sales, with $115 billion impact on our economy. This industry also supports 800,000 jobs, which depend on healthy fisheries resources. This legislation will protect and restore aquatic communities around the nation through public-private partnerships to promote conservation. This legislation has the support from a large number of industry groups, including the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, as well as the American Sport Fishing Association, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and backcountry hunters and anglers. This legislation takes the current program and makes it more effective by increasing transparency and putting power back in the hands of the stakeholders and requiring accountability to Congress. H.R. 1747 will make sure taxpayers' dollars go further to conserve fish habitat. Again, I'm grateful for the consideration of my legislation. However, I'd also like to point out that there are other bipartisan priorities, including the Ranking Member Bishop's bipartisan-supported Parks backlog legislation that deserves a vote on the House floor. We need to push to get real results on all of these important issues. That being said, I'd like to thank you again for your consideration of H.R. 1747, and I urge the committee's support for this legislation.
Gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Hoffman for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to commend Mr. Whitman and Mr. Veazey for their very thoughtful work on this bill. It came through my subcommittee, and it's a great example of the kind of bipartisan cooperation I hope we can see more of, especially when it comes to protecting fish and wildlife at a moment when all of the science tells us we have to do much, much more to protect fish and wildlife. So thank you. Natural freshwater, estuarine, and marine habitats provided by rivers, streams, lakes, wetlands, coasts, and reefs are critical to the survival of fish in the United States. But over time, many of these habitats have been destroyed, fragmented, and degraded by human settlement and the competing use of space for agriculture, transportation, infrastructure, energy, and mineral resource extraction, among other things. In fact, over 22% of inland stream miles in the continental United States are at high or very high risk of habitat degradation. That's why this bill is so very important. The purpose is to protect, restore, and enhance fish and aquatic habitat, and in doing so, this bill provides another example of how habitat conservation can benefit biodiversity and ecosystems, as well as the many Americans who like to recreate. Specifically, it will codify an existing program to authorize the National Fish Habitat Partnership, a grassroots program started in 2006 through a state-led public-private partnership at the Fish and Wildlife Service. The bill would establish also a National Fish Habitat Board to oversee its implementation. The partnership and this board will work with stakeholders and private partners to identify and fund conservation programs supporting a $125 billion recreational fishing industry that provides more than 800,000 jobs across the country. So again, thank you for this good work, Mr. Whitman. I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Before we consider amendment, does any member wish to be recognized on the legislation? If there's no further debate, we have an amendment submitted by Representative Gonzalez Cologne. You have the amendment, and you're recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. Cologne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment to H.R. 1747, the National Fish Habitat Conservation through Partnership Act, will clarify the definition of states provided in the bill to ensure it also includes Puerto Rico and the rest of the U.S. territories, Guam, American Samoa, Northern Mariana Islands, the United States Virgin Islands, and the District of Columbia. This bill, introduced by our colleague, Congressman Wood from Virginia, will also authorize the National Fish and Habitat Partnerships, a voluntary non-regulatory fish habitat conservation program led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And those partnerships are comprised of representatives of federal, state, and local agencies, conservation and sportsman organizations, private land owners, and the business sector. This program then identifies and carries out fish and habitat restoration projects throughout the nation. Efforts to restore aquatic habitat is particularly important for jurisdictions like Puerto Rico, where commercial and recreational fisheries are an important source of employment, income, and sustenance to many coastal communities. Our statistics from Puerto Rico show that the number of commercial fishermen on the island has fluctuated between 1,200 and 1,500. The number of recreational fishermen is estimated to be anywhere between 150,000 and 200,000 people. Between 2010 and 2015, fishermen in Puerto Rico landed on average about 2.4 million pounds of finfish and shellfish, with dockside revenues of 8.6 million per year. A NOAA study similarly estimated that the total angler expenditures on marine recreational fishing amounted to 72 million just in 2011. Protecting fish habitat is therefore vital for our island's economy as well as the rest of the island territories. And for us, it's important to have the same opportunities as the states to participate in the national fish habitat partnerships. This in turn will allow territorial fish and wildlife agencies as well as private stakeholders to effectively work together towards the conservation and restoration of our aquatic system. I commend Congressman Whitman for introducing this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support my amendment on the bill. With that, I yield back.
Case to speak to the amendment, right?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And speaking in favor of the amendment, first of all, I commend the introducer of the amendment. I think this is the right move on this particular bill. I see no policy reasons to distinguish between Puerto Rico and D.C. and the territories and the states in this area. And I think this amendment is an important opportunity to make a point that when we're dealing with our marine ecosystems, they don't care whether a particular jurisdiction is a territory or a state. They don't care whether a particular jurisdiction is this country or that. They are working in one large ocean ecosystem. And I think what we need to focus on a lot more in terms of our oceans, and with other environmental issues that we are dealing with on a daily basis here, is that these are integrated ecosystems where if you affect an ecosystem 1,000 miles away in the Pacific Ocean, you are going to indirectly affect an ecosystem the other 1,000 miles away. This happens in Hawaii, where we stretch out for almost 1,500 miles from one end of the state to the other. And what happens on one end of that 1,500-mile change impacts another. So as we assist in conservation efforts in Puerto Rico, just as an example, we are also assisting in fish conservation efforts in Florida, for example. And so I think we've got to start thinking this way. I think this amendment is a good time to recognize that basic truth of nature.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak in strong favor of the amendment. Thank Ms. Gonzalez-Colon for introducing it. Indeed, we want to make sure that Puerto Rico is part of these partnerships. I think it's a great example about how to bring all the different stakeholders together, state, federal, and local decision makers, as well as folks in the recreational fishing community and everybody that has an interest there. So certainly it was not my intent to leave out Puerto Rico, but thank you for including it.
Any further discussion on the amendment? And let me thank the sponsor of the amendment, Ms. Colon. Excellent amendment. It perfects a good piece of legislation and much appreciated. If there's no further debate, the question is on the Gonzalez-Colon amendment to the legislation. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. If there's no further amendments, the question is on adopting the bill as amended in order to favorably report it to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The item for consideration is H.R. 925, offered by Representative Thompson of California. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife be discharged for further consideration of the bill, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Representative Huffman to speak to the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to urge my colleagues to support another one of the many bipartisan bills in the markup today that came through the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittee. Congressman Thompson's bill, the North American Wetlands Conservation Extension Act, is a great example of good work and bipartisanship. A number of Republicans on this committee are co-sponsors, and so I hope we'll see strong support for this bill. It would reauthorize NACA for 5 years at $60 million per year. This is a widely popular conservation program that's particularly popular with hunters. NACA protects birds and fish habitat across the country by funding projects that reduce coastal erosion, control flooding, and improve water and air quality. According to Ducks Unlimited, each federal dollar spent from the NACA program leverages $3 to $4 of local investment. So NACA is a good deal for the taxpayers, and thanks to this program, almost 29.8 million acres of habitat have been protected. We need more of that. The United States has lost a considerable portion of its wetlands. Conservation and restoration of these valuable ecosystems is critical. Wetlands not only provide recreational opportunities like hunting and fishing for Americans, they also serve as powerful carbon sinks, making them an important tool in countering the impacts of climate change. So I believe this bill and the NACA program are a win-win, and I urge an aye vote from my colleagues and yield back.
Mr. Whip, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Mr. Thompson for leading on this legislation. It is indeed an important piece of our efforts to make sure we're preserving wetlands. Mr. Thompson and I serve on the Migratory Bird Conservation Commission, which directs funds to be used, many of which are private funds. NACA is one of those incredibly valuable programs where there are almost 3 private dollars for every 1 public dollar that goes into protecting critical wetlands. And whether you are a lover of fish or migratory birds or shorebirds, whatever the case may be, this habitat is absolutely critical. It's proven to be one of the most successful programs, having been in place for over 30 years, has preserved an incredible number of acres of wetlands areas, which we know are incredibly important. Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to submit a letter from different sportsmen's groups supporting this bill to the record. I hope that you'll accept that in the record, and I would ask my colleagues to support this legislation.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
Before we consider any amendments, does any other member wish to be recognized in the legislation?
Yep.
No? Yes. Mr. Bishop. Recognized, sir.
Thank you, I think this is going to be one of those things that we often do on the floor, which means I'm going to claim time in opposition, though I'm not really in opposition. NACA is a good program. Should it be reauthorized? Of course it should. Is this reauthorization okay? Yes, it is. The problem, though, is I'm not going to vote yes. In fact, I'll probably vote yes in any other situation, but I'm not going to vote yes today, not with frustration of this bill, which is a good bill, but frustration with this particular committee, which once again misses the point that we shouldn't be expanding our intake of other resources and lands until we take care of those we already have. And this Congress, this committee, has already moved on that by passing a backlog bill back in July. That bill has 312 co-sponsors at this stage of the game. It has support in the Senate, it has support from the administration. It is something that could easily be done and should be done. And yet, despite that fact, despite the fact that 72% of this committee are co-sponsors of this bill, both Republicans and Democrats, it's still sitting here in the committee. In July, we passed it out. It has yet to be referred to the House. The committee is still sitting on this particular piece of legislation. This bill should be going by suspension. This bill should be presented to the House. It should have been done by now. There is no logical reason why not to do this particular bill and do it now. And yet, we hear reports coming from spokesmen of the committee that says, and this was back in July, we're still compiling report materials, including forthcoming analysis from the Congressional Budget Office. Other bills that were passed in that same markup have already had their CBO score and are reported to the House. This committee has the ability of telling and prioritizing bills to CBO to get them there and reported to the House. There is no logical reason why this bill has not been reported to the House. There is no logical reason in the world why this bill has not been voted on in the House. And I'm tired, though, of people coming up to me trying to make deals. Let's trade off the backlog for something else, including this particular piece of legislation. Now, let them stand. If they're decent bills, NOC is a decent bill. It can stand on its own, it can be voted on its own. It doesn't have to be tied to something else. But the backlog bill has to be voted on in the House. There is no reason why it still should be here in the committee. That was in July. Now, damn it, I am going to pose this particular bill simply for the record, to make sure that it is not considered as unanimous for the record, because we're playing games with the backlog bill, and we're playing games on the House floor. But I do want it to be known that I'm going to continue to oppose any other conservation effort that comes until we have a vote on the floor of the backlog bill and get this thing moving forward. It took the effort of a whole lot of private special interest groups to put pressure on this committee to hear it in the first place, and now they're still facing the same frustration of trying to get it heard on the floor. There is no reason it has not been heard on the floor. There are 312 co-sponsors. There are only 7 bills that have more co-sponsors than that. And the majority of those 7 have already been heard on the floor. This one needs to be heard on the floor. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask you once again to get this out of committee and move the process. Get this bill heard on the floor. And then I'd be more than happy to work on a lot of these other bipartisan bills like this one, which is still a good bill. But I'm going to vote no simply because I'm making a statement that this committee is playing games that should not be played in a non-partisan, in a strictly partisan basis. And that's why I say this, my frustration. I claim time in opposition, though I'm not opposed to this particular bill. But I am opposed to what we're doing, and I want to see a change. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman, may I?
Sir, you're recognized.
I'd like to support my ranking member's position, certainly not with the oratory passion that he has for this, but you know, as one of the 300-plus co-sponsors of this, I think it deserves its day on the floor. This is one of those no-brainers that should come to the floor and should be passed. And so with that, I'd support my colleague.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't think of another piece of legislation that has more than 300 sponsors and enjoys the bipartisan support that this bill does that our ranking member talked about. So I'm going to add my name to that list, that I believe that it's more than appropriate, it's warranted, that that bill be heard before we proceed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Go, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, while I supported NACA funding in the past and support matching grants to state, local, and tribal governments, this bill is fiscally irresponsible and needs some additional reforms. We heard this morning in regards to our CZMA program, where we're trying to use duplicative buildups of the bureaucracy when we can streamline the process by adequately funding a bill. So I have some concerns with some of the way the land acquisitions have occurred in the past and their impact on private property. I would have liked to see some additional safeguards in that regard, like those that were included in H.R. 2208 from the 113th Congress. Additionally, this bill is fiscally irresponsible, getting back to what we were talking about this morning with CZMA. All the things that we had in 2 bills could have been done within the current structure of CZMA by properly funding it. So when we look at this, in the past, the responsibility of Fish and Wildlife Service received an appropriation of $33.6 million in fiscal year 2019 for the program. This bill increases the authorization of the appropriations to $60 million for 5 years. Our current debt, national debt, exceeds $22 trillion, Mr. Chairman. We're essentially trying to double the appropriations for this program within this bill. We're out of money. We continue to build duplicative programs, funding that, wasting money that could go to the ground where it's basically needed. I also don't see an offset for this bill. That's problematic. I oppose this legislation as a result, even though I have been a stalwart supporter of NAWCA in the past. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just recalling a few years back when Jonathan Jarvis, who was then the Obama National Park Service Director, appeared before our committee. I asked him, given the choice, what would you spend money on? Taking care of the land we already have or acquiring new land? And he says, well, I don't want to make that choice, but if I had to, obviously, take care of the land we already have. And as the ranking member said, we are not. I've often quoted our colleague, Mr. Gomert, who's compared the federal government land policies to the old miser in town whose own house is dilapidated, the paint's peeling, the screens are ripped, there are weeds growing in the yard, because he spends all of his time plotting how he's going to buy his neighbor's land. Lincoln once referred to a farmer who said, I ain't greedy for land, all I want's what's next to mine. Well, these land acquisitions may be important, but what's far more important is taking care of the land we already have. We've done a miserable job of that. We have an enormous backlog not only in the national park system, but through all of the public lands. We're watching our forests dying for lack of proper maintenance. And it seems to me that we ought to get our priorities straight here, and we haven't. So I fully concur with the remarks of the ranking member, and would just ask that we maybe apply a little common sense, take care of what we already have before we acquire new land.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back. Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just briefly not take everyone's time, but associate myself with the comments of the ranking member and my other colleagues in reference to the backlog bill. Thank you. I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Lumber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would yield my time to the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Lamborn. I do want to echo the ranking member's concerns about making sure that his bill, the bipartisan bill, comes to the floor. I think it's incredibly important that we do bills like NACA. I appreciate my colleagues' observations about the bill, but it is critical that we look at all of these across the spectrum, including the ranking member's bill that is broadly bipartisan, and I think it's critically important to making sure that we are doing both, that we are looking at preserving critical habitat, but also taking care of the habitat that we have. His bill does that, creates a priority there, and folks, we can do both, and we must do both. If we're all serious, which I know we are, about preserving and conserving the resources that we have within the government portfolio, it's incredibly important that we take care of the properties that we have. So with that, I want to speak again in favor of the chairman's, of the ranking member's observations about his bill. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. And I concur with the comments of many that this is a bill of high importance. So is the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And I hope that we soon will be able to move those onto the floor, and they have been requested as such, but they've been requested as a tandem, and I think that's an important consideration going forward. Does anyone else wish to be recognized on the legislation? And does any member wish to offer an amendment? If there's no further amendments, the question is on adopting the bill and ordering it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably. Recorded vote has been requested and postponed based on prior announcements. The question will now go into those unfinished business of bills that were required a recorded vote. And this is final passage, the Coastal Climate Bill. The question is on adopting 3541. Members will record their vote. What's happening?
Here's your intermediate script.
What's that for?
Voting's now open.
Has every member voted?
Hold on 1 second, hold on.
Someone want to wake up Johnson, tell him to vote? Vote.
Does any member wish to change their vote? And if every member has confirmed their vote, the vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the yeas are 20 and the nays are 15.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The next recorded vote is final passage, 3596 as amended. The question is on adopting H.R. 3596 as amended and ordering favorably reported to the House. Members will record their votes, and the voting is now open. Has every member voted? If every member has confirmed their vote, the vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 22 and the nays are 13.
The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Final passage. Final passage is 2185, DC flood prevention. The question is on adopting 2185 and ordering favorably reported to the House. The voting is now open. Members should record their vote. Has every member voted? Every member confirmed their vote? If so, the vote is closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 20 and the nays are 15.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The question is on adopting H.R. 3115 as amended and ordering it favorably reported to the House. Members will record their vote. The voting is now open.
There are no amendments.
Has everyone voted? Has every member confirmed their vote? If so,
Wait.
if every member has confirmed the vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 22 and the nays are 13.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Final passage. The question is on adopting H.R. 925 and ordering it favorably reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. No.
We did that.
No.
The question is
Oh,
on.
the question is on, voting is now open. The question is on H.R. 925. Has every member voted?
You have to vote, sir.
Except for me.
Just wait, Ms. Dingle.
If every member has confirmed their vote, the vote is now closed, and the clerk will report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 26 and the nays are 9.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Thank you very much. With the cooperation of Ranking Member Bishop and other members of the committee, it appears we have worked out an agreement on 3 bills scheduled for markup today. Before we begin, does any member seek time to speak on any of the bills in this unanimous consent package? As we've done before, I'd like to a single UC motion to discharge the agreed upon bills. I ask unanimous consent that the Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 1472, H.R. 1487, and H.R. 1492. Without objection, so ordered. I now ask unanimous consent that the following bills be adopted and favorably reported as described, reported as described to the House of Representatives. H.R. 1472, H.R. 1487 with an amendment designated Grijalva number 1, H.R. 1492 with an amendment in the nature of a substitute filed by myself. Without objection, so ordered. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Is that it? All members will have 2 days in which to file supplemental, additional, minority, or dissenting views. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bills order reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. I also ask unanimous consent that for any bill order reported today with amendments, that the bill be considered reported with an amendment to strike out all after the enacting clause and insert the text of the bill with its perfecting amendments adopted in the committee. Without objection, so ordered. Again, thank the ranking member and other members of the committee for helping move this markup along, and with a unanimous consent agenda. If there's no further business, we're adjourned.